And I just want to end with, or this part of it, I'll talk a little bit about the second set of data we have, but I want to just talk about some of the issues that this raises for me, and if you guys have any ideas or suggestions on how to deal with that, these issues, that would be great. So I'm asking for your help and brainstorming on these questions. So the first question that comes to my mind is, are there actions and attitudes of the government that are not captured by measuring through the laws and the newspapers, such as the demolishing of migrant enclaves? So I was in Beijing before the Olympics, and the government was raising enclaves, and really they were really cracking down on the immigrants in the city. But that wasn't represented in a legal change. You can't see that happening in the laws. They just look strict before and they look strict after, and you can't see that change in state tolerance in those laws. So I'm wondering if there are is something else that might capture that, and maybe through the interviews or the newspapers, I'm not sure, but I'll have to deal with that issue. Another question is, do fewer laws in some cities mean less regulation? So Wuhan only has 16 laws, but there's 30 in Nanjing. Does that mean that there's less regulation in Wuhan, or does it mean that they're just regulated using a different mode of regulation? And what's this relationship between fewer laws and more or less tolerance, and also how does that impact the informal economy? And that's my bigger project, right? Now that I know that there's these differences in state tolerance in these different cities, how does that shape the informal economy in each of those cities? And then, are there fewer laws regulating migrants in secondary cities like Wuhan? Is that just Wuhan, or are most of these secondary cities have less laws regulating the migrants? And over time, do we expect to see more in these secondary cities? If these secondary cities are receiving more migrants, does that equal more regulation? Is there a connection there? And then, despite having these fewer laws in the second-tier cities, right now, the periodization doesn't match up. So there's the 6 periods of state tolerance on the national level, but on the local levels, we don't see this matching up. So we have to explain why. If Beijing is really not tolerant towards migrants, but Nanjing is really tolerant towards not migrants, why? What explains this difference? Okay, so the second set of data we're looking at is newspapers. So hopefully newspapers will help us answer some of the questions that the laws and the analysis of the laws don't answer. One source that we're using is this database, which is used by academics across China. It has 1,000 newspapers that are in the database, and it starts from 2000 and moves forward. There are over 4 million articles in the database. And this database cannot stand by itself in terms of our data because it starts at 2000, and that's the last period of state tolerance in our national level periodization. So the other source of data with this database so far, what we've done is just do counts to see how much are migrants talked about in the newspapers in the different cities. And then what we'll do is we'll do an in-depth sort of discourse analysis and content analysis on the actual way that the newspapers are discussing these migrants. But I wanted to just share with you, oh no, whoops. We came up with a list of search terms in Chinese to search the databases. And those are the English translations, which aren't very helpful because it's really hard to translate some of these terms. But the most common term is nongminggong, which is the first term. And then migrants are often also referred to as outsiders. I was referred to as an outsider too, so it can be a little confusing. And they're also referred to as surplus labor. So what we did was we searched these terms in the newspapers. And I should say about the newspapers, sorry, I don't know what I did with my other slide, but we chose 3 newspapers from each city so we could compare across the 3 cities. And I think I have it here. And the, okay, so we searched these three terms, and the most interesting thing I found was that in Wuhan, where there's less migrants and there's less restrictions on migrants in terms of laws, there's more discussion in the newspapers. They're talked about way more in the newspapers in Wuhan than in the other cities. In Beijing, they're the least talked about. And so discussion of migrants is much greater in Wuhan compared to Beijing. So that sort of surprised me. Why is that? And I thought, well, maybe it's because in Wuhan they use the term nongminglong, and in Beijing and Nanjing maybe they're using a different term. But as you can see, that's not the case. At this point in China, nongminglong is pretty standard language when you're talking about the migrants. And because I combined all the other terms, and they're not used nearly as much as nongminglong, regardless of what city. So that raises some questions. The other interesting thing that came up was that the discussion in the newspapers in all three cities jumped up in 2007, and I have no idea why. And there's nothing in any of these papers that discuss why this might be the case. So there was this rise of discussion, and now it's sort of petering out. So that's something that needs to be looked at and explained. And I'm imagining this probably is a national level phenomenon because it's a pattern that is occurring in all three cities. So this data raises the questions, you know, are migrants more likely to be discussed in these second-tier cities like Wuhan? Why? What, if anything, explains that relationship between laws and the discussion in newspapers? Is there a relationship, and if so, what? Why? And also, of course, that peak. What was the big discussion happening in 2007? And also, when we get into the in-depth analysis of the articles, we want to look at how migrants are talked about and what language, and if there's a set of language that's used during periods of more tolerance versus periods of less tolerance. And so that's our next step. We're starting to dive into analyzing the content of the articles. So let me just end my talk by saying where we're going with this. We will be delving into the articles, both from 2000 forward in electronic form and in newspaper archives this summer in the cities. We will continue the analysis of the laws, and this summer we'll be doing interview data. So we want to take these questions that have come up and make sure to use the interviews as a third set of data that can help us answer some of these questions that the other data doesn't answer. And then to take this concept of state tolerance to understand how it's shaping the informal market in different cities in China. So I will stop here and hopefully get some feedback from you. Thank you.
Sarah? It might be interesting to try and figure out whether the change in tolerance over time reflects different kinds of workers. Are those who are high risk takers or in certain occupations more likely to try to get into the informal market?
Oh, that's interesting.
Where those who are more traditional and cautious. And I mean, there might be some very interesting sociodemographic differences. I don't know if you can get at them.
Yeah,
it would be fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a database that I'm getting access to that might have the data to take a look at those kinds of questions. So, yeah, that's a good suggestion.
Younger people might be more risk takers, men rather than women.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah, yeah.
As far as your interview data, are you going to be interviewing the migrants or like people in the government or both?
Probably both, because I think, first of all, the government workers often give insight into the enforcement of laws versus the actual existence of laws, which is an important element, one factor in that measurement of state tolerance. And then also the way that migrants perceive how they're being tolerated is important too. So I imagine it will be both. We'll do interviews with both.